it's now just about to start going into practice at the local on-the-ground stage through what we call proto-bees, which are actual communities of people living in part game bee ways of life and actually developing local operating systems for governing how they live. The very first one has actually closed on its land.
I'm Brian Mose, a farmer living in Florence, South Dakota, and you're listening to the Vance Crowe podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today, you can see we are doing something totally different. I had Jim Rutt come join me in the Articulate Ventures Underground Bar for the first ever podcast in virtual reality. I don't know if anybody else has ever done a podcast in VR, but Jim is one of those people that if you're going to get the attention of a guy that has his brain space, his network, his ideas, his enthusiasm, then you've got to use it for things that are going to push the envelope. And that is exactly what we did today. We jumped into VR. We had the experience of talking about what is it like in VR. And then we just did a regular podcast where we talked about everything from artificial intelligence to consciousness to the changes of language and really how he interacts and engages with people, finishing up with a really interesting conversation about his program, Game B. I am so glad you're here. I'm glad you're interested in these kind of exciting ideas. And if you've been one of those people, which I have them reach out to me all the time on Twitter and send me emails that have thought about joining the Articulate Ventures Network, let VR be one of those things that brings you into it. It is really difficult to figure out where to go, what to do, how to make it worthwhile. But if you're a person that wants to explore this new world, it's something we are doing all the time in the network. And it's not just me. I'm actually one of the people that took the first steps in there, but now we've got people building their own VR worlds, people starting up different field trips that we can take and all kinds of experiences. And you can be one of those people. Even if you don't know where you're going to fit when you join the network, everybody comes in, they realize that there's this explosion of enthusiasm, that there's somebody new there with something to share. And then everybody finds a spot for them to contribute and things that they get out of it that we couldn't even anticipate. So if you're interested in joining the network, I hope you'll go to network.articulate.ventures to sign up and know that we would love to see you in VR. So now, without further ado, we're going to go to my man, Jim Rutt. Well, Jim Rutt, welcome back to the podcast, only this time in virtual reality.
Yeah, Vance Crowe, great to be here. This is a new thing for me. I've only been in VR once before, and that was hanging out with you. And this is certainly the first time I've tried to do a VR podcast. So we're out there on the ragged edge.
Yeah, and so for listeners, people that are just listening and not watching this, we are in the Articulate Ventures Underground Bar. So this is the place that we come to do our book club. And we've had the book club for about a year, and then we decided, well, let's try and do this in VR. And it was such a big hit. People enjoyed it so much more because of the thing that you talked about. It's kind of the split between the loose connections that you only get from reading what other people say or seeing their posts on social media, and the strong bonds that come from being in person. This is somewhere in between there.
Yeah, this is quite interesting. This is something I've been talking about for quite a while, is the weak links, strong links, and the combination of the two is very useful for building movements, etc. And then, of course, our year of Zoom has taught us that Zooms are somewhere in between also. But VR feels to me like it's maybe closer to face-to-face, not the same. We are primates after all. We deal a lot with smell and details of facial expressions and such, which at least so far aren't turning up in VR. On the other hand, as you pointed out, the audio spatial aspects are important. So it's going to be quite fun to see how VR fits in my taxonomy of links. I suspect somewhere between Zoom and face-to-face, but probably closer to Zoom than face-to-face.
Yeah, I do think there's something weird about it. And I am always a big proponent of being able to see people's faces, because I think, the ability to see if they're smiling, if they look like they're trying to manipulate you, these are things that we've learned or evolved to learn over time really in depth. But then I get into VR and I say, well, I don't know. There's something about the feeling like I'm in the same three-dimensional space as you that makes me feel more connected than a lot of the Zoom calls I've been on.
Yep, I agree. I think a bit more, it's definitely better than Zoom, but it would be great if they could somehow capture our facial expressions and particularly our eyes. I always found eyes to be key. What was it? Somebody said the windows to the soul. And obviously, in these very simple avatars, we don't have anything like that.
But the thing that we do have that we've discovered is when you talk, it makes your head kind of shake or grow. Sometimes it'll make the avatars, the lips will shake or grow, so that way you can tell who's talking. And then we also figured out that avatars with hands are a lot more able to communicate than people without hands. And so because you figure out, somebody maybe says like, oh, it's my turn, or you add a lot more gestures, so the hands actually end up being an important part of communicating inside of here.
It makes sense. I'll pretend to be Italian today. Hey, Giuseppe.
So when you remember back with VR, you were kind of always up on the leading edge. What was kind of the promise of VR as you were getting started?
Yeah, the first time I kind of stuck my nose in VR was, 1994 or something like that, when Jaron Lanier was kind of the leading explorer in that realm. And truthfully, the thought was that virtual worlds would be available, and that was the goal. Now, it was always a second order kind of businessy thing, like, maybe it'd be useful for industrial training or training the military or something like that. And as we know, that's where actually some of the biggest business successes here in our third generation VR have actually occurred in industrial training and in military simulations. But so yeah, I think the vision hasn't really changed. It's just as Moore's law has caught up, we've been able to deliver something closer to the vision from 1994 in a non too annoying format. For our listeners out there, we're both. Vance and I are both wearing Oculus Quest 2s, I believe. And they're pretty cheap, $300, something like that. They don't require to be tethered to a computer. Their resolution isn't the ultimate, but it ain't bad. It's good enough, unlike VR in 1994.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely still just trying to use as many triangles as they can, really simple shapes. If you're watching it, it's probably a little bit better than Minecraft if you're using a browser. But I have seen some stuff that is really on the edge as far as like being able to make things come to life. But everybody's got different internet speeds. The headsets are all different. I think one of the big differences that I'm already observing is the best stuff are not made in apps right now. The best stuff is done through browsers. And when I was talking with my friend Anthony DePascal, he's talking about how that the ability to build worlds on just regular websites makes it so you don't have so much of that walled garden experience, where if you have the Oculus, you can only do Oculus things with Oculus people. And instead, you can use any headset you want because everybody navigates to the same space.
So does that mean that someone could come into this bar through the Mozilla hub and use a different headset?
Yeah, they could use a different headset, or for the book club right now, probably about half of the people just come in on their computers or even their phones. The downside of somebody using their phone is you've got to really scale back the graphics. And as you can see in this room, we have a lot of good book covers, things that are kind of high resolution. So for those people, it becomes kind of obnoxious. But you could be on your computer in here just as easily.
Though you wouldn't get the immersive VR effect.
Yeah, in fact, when people are on their computers, I think they wonder why everybody in VR thinks it's so amazing and we love it so much. But it's because you don't get the sense of looking around. I mean, it genuinely feels like you and I are sitting here. I want to turn my head and look at you, and I feel weird if I'm looking this way and not at you. even though we're not in the same room. So the actual physically moving your head and moving around, I think, is one of the reasons it feels so much more real.
Yeah, and also the the embedding. I'm looking around, looking at these very cool book covers you have on the wall, and the fine grained wood floor, and the wood ceiling, and the stone wall, and it's like real life. It attracts you're having a relatively high bandwidth experience, which is interesting. Again, I don't know what it all means, what it's good for, but it's certainly different. Even on Zoom, you tend not to really notice the background much. And of course, a lot of people use fake backgrounds. I generally don't, but once in a while I do. Here we have a fake background, but one with a lot of nuance to it. It's kind of cool.
Well, and in this space, I actually had spent quite a bit of time, I'm kind of an amateur lover of architecture. I could never actually build a real building that anyone would ever want to walk into. But in this space, I was able to take some principles. And I remember having heard not that long ago that the reason New York is so famous for doing comedy is because all of the comedy clubs were built before they were building codes. And so they could have these low ceilings, and that low ceiling makes people have the impression of feeling really close in. And one of the things I noticed about VR was people would build these giant spaces because the materials don't cost anything. But really, if you're trying to create an experience with human beings, creating a space that pushes them together and makes them feel like they're a part of something really kind of makes the whole experience better.
Yeah, that's, I think, exactly right. I've noticed that in business. When you have a startup company and you move to your new space, still recall my very first startup, we had 100 people crammed into 4,100 square feet. That's pretty crammed, let me tell you. And then we moved to 10,000 square feet, and it felt like something was wrong with our culture for a while because suddenly the density had fallen by a factor of 2.5. Then we decided to pack the various units together into subsets of the space to recover something close to our previous density, and then the culture started feeling right again. So I think there's really something about density as something that we react to in a pretty solidly human way.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the giant movement towards open offices. And it was kind of sold to everyone as, oh, we'll be more communal. We'll be able to, people will see each other more. And the funny thing, I don't know about everybody, but I know for me, the only work that I do that's valuable requires me to focus. It requires me to not have distraction, not hear other people's phones. But I agree. I don't mind being around a lot of other people, but I need to, at some level, be able to close the door and not have interruptions if I'm going to do work that's more valuable than the work I would do by, watching TV or something.
Yeah, it's interesting. I used to feel that way, and perhaps for me, it's still true. But I have seen a whole bunch of quite successful tech startups that do have, 7 people sitting right next to each other on a long bench. And they seem to have developed the ability to go into the tube and do their work, despite people 2 feet to the left and to the right of them. And it does, of course, facilitate real-time conversations, right? Of course, you need some meta signaling. When am I available to be talked to? But it certainly allows that serendipitous conversation to happen at a higher rate. So it may be that you're just an old fart, even though you're a relatively young old fart, right? That you haven't figured out how to operate in that space. Because I've been to these companies and I kind of shudder a little bit trying to envision myself in that space. But some of these companies have produced some remarkable products. Some of the companies I've been involved with as an advisor, an investor, a board member, et cetera. And I think it's just different, a different set of skills and affordances. Affordance means things you can do. The idea that you can be 2 feet from somebody and hit them on with your elbow and say, come over on the screen here and look at my code and let's walk through the code together. Is something that's much more likely to happen than if we're each in our 10 by 10s and, you got to get up, walk down the hall, blah, blah, blah. So it's different, and I'm not sure I'd be able to deal with it, but I can say that it does work.
Well, I have several friends that have all engineered their own brown noise machine headphones, right? Where it's some amount of static that allows them to have to be able to block things out. And one of my friends was talking about really wanting to have a light signal on there, like, green means go ahead and bump me, yellow means, send me a message and I'll pop out, and red means don't interrupt, because I, for one, I am capable of reading at a very, very high velocity. But if somebody interrupts me, it's no different from a person like waking me up out of a dead sleep. My instantaneous reaction is anger. And I'm not an angry person. I'm like an amiable, happy person. But if I'm reading and get interrupted, it will take me minutes to be able to come back down, even if it was a totally reasonable request for somebody to interrupt me.
Yeah, it's funny. Reading doesn't bother me too much. I think I can sync back up in 30 seconds or a minute. But programming, oh my God, right? If I'm deep into a hard part of a program, it can take me 20 minutes to get to resync. And there's some, cognitive science research that indicates something like a 20 per minute reset time when you're doing your best and hardest thinking, because you got to get completely back into that state where it's all in your head. At least my style of programming is I build a quite elaborate mental model of what I'm doing, which allows me to operate at pretty high velocity. But if I get interrupted at all by anything, the model collapses and it takes a while to rebuild it.
Yeah, that's the same thing for me, what you're describing. For me, when I read, if I am really into it, I don't even see the words anymore. It's just me flipping pages. It's not only like second after second, but I mean, I don't really sit there and have to think about the words, and to get popped out of it it takes a long time to get up to that speed again. But I'm not a programmer, so I don't have the same experience in programming. What do you program these days? I mean, how do you stay current and being able to program things that matter instead of just going back and remaking Pong or something?
Oh yeah, and I just as a discipline, I teach myself a new computer language every year. I now know about 30 computer languages at the level of being able to do a hello world, or actually I used to do a little bit more than that. 2020, I did F#, which was my first foray into so-called functional programming, which is a whole new style of programming. It's been around for quite a while, but I've had conversations with people. One of my good friends is a very passionate advocate for Haskell, which is perhaps the purest functional programming language. And so I decided this year I was going to do F#. And it was fun. I liked it a lot. As to the kind of projects I do for more serious work, my current number one project is I have had a vision for years of a different kind of neural net for AI and for a learning algorithm, different than anything else that exists. And I got it mentally specified about 3 years ago, and then my life took off into too many adventures, and I was never able to instantiate it as code. But this year over Christmas, I took 2 weeks off and spent a lot of time with my family, but I also spent 3 or 4 hours a day creating this new kind of neural net. And I got it up and I got it running. I've got it running on, I got it rudimentarily processing one of the most famous AI test problems called the MNIST handwritten digits problem. Basically, it's a set of 60,000 handwritten digits, 0 through 9, with all kinds of idiosyncratic writing styles. And the AI problem is to look at the digits as a raster field, a bunch of dots, and decide what digit it is, right? And it's a very interesting problem because it's not real hard, but not real easy. Lots of learning algorithms will show no traction on it at all. Any decent learning algorithm will show some traction, but nobody has ever solved it at 100% level. I think we're currently up to like 99.85 of the 64,000 digits can be labeled correctly. So I've gotten it up to that point, though I have not hooked in the learning algorithm, which is the interesting part. I'm taking a week off the week of April 5th, and at least part of that week, I intend to, maybe get another 15 or 20 hours in on this entirely new radical architecture for a learning neural net with its own new learning algorithm. So that's the kind of stuff I do. The thing I did before that is I wrote an AI that exhibited rudimentary consciousness, at least I would so argue. And I hooked it into rudimentary consciousness. And I instantiated it as a deer running around in a field full of obstacles. And I wrote the AI in one environment, and I wrote the deer in Unity 3D, which is a game programming environment, so I could get some high-resolution graphics. And then the interesting and fun part is I had to write my own custom communications layer to let Unity talk to this AI engine. And I managed to create a really high-speed communications pipe that was like, how many times faster? At least 100 times faster than the ones that the AI framework people had created, which really sucked. And being able to, send 200,000 messages a second allowed me to do amazingly fine-grained behaviors in the deer with the AI engine. So those are the kinds of things I work on. And of course, one of the problems with programming is if you're not doing it every day, your fingers forget, right? And so it always takes me 2 or 3 days to kind of ramp back up when I start a project, which is the reason I tend to do it in big chunks of time rather than saying, well, don't you always have an hour here or there? Yeah, I have an hour here or there. But an hour of programming when you haven't done it in 2 weeks is damn close to useless.
Sorry, that's one of the problems of VR. I just accidentally hit a button and then was morphed across the room. So that actually gives me a whole new level of, I don't want to say respect, but when you were talking with Yosha Bach, which, by the way, I think that is one of the most amazing interviews I personally have ever heard, was your second interview with him. But every time I listen to a new interview with you, and we should talk more about your podcast because I'd like to get into that, but you were really harsh on GPT-3. And I've had some pretty advanced programmers on the podcast that have spoken pretty highly of GPT-3 and where it's going. So when you were pushing on that, saying like, it's not learning, it's just using a data set that's finite. And I was kind of like, well, who's this guy to be talking about the misgivings of GPT-3? But if you're out there doing your own learning algorithms, there's a whole new level of respect I have for you.
Yeah, I've been doing that stuff since, at least 20 years. I wrote one of the first genetic neural algorithms where we used Darwinian evolution to evolve neural nets and used it to create game playing.
That's the second time you've referenced neural nets, and I couldn't give a description of a neural net if somebody asked me.
Okay, well, most of the AIs that we're hearing about, the so-called deep learning type AIs, they are neural networks, which means that they are a very rough, cartoonish, similar to the way our brains are wired. That think of it as a whole series of nodes that have links between them. The links have weights. And let's say that, and there's layers of these nodes. Imagine 500 nodes in a line, then 500 nodes above that, and 500 nodes above that, and then each layer has connections to the next layer down. And in the general case, kind of the lazy case, all 500 in this layer are connected to all 500 in the next layer, but the weights differ. And not only do they differ, some are positive and some are negative. And so let's say the top level is where the input comes. So let's imagine in like this MNIST problem I discussed, it's a very simple, I think it's 16 by 16 dots to exemplify the handwritten digit. So let's make 256 dots the top layer of the neural net. The digits that are turned on are 0, and the ones that are off are 1, or vice versa. Though actually MNIST, it's 0 to 255, but to keep it simple. And then that signal propagates down to the next level through these weighted links, and to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. Let's say the bottom level is just 10 nodes, which represent the digits 0 to 9. And the number of times or the strength of the signal being reached at that bottom node is the signal on which digit it is. So there's a really crude example of what a neural net is. And essentially everything you've heard about in AI, with some notable and I think important exceptions, is neural nets of one sort or another. AlphaGo, the great Go playing program, AlphaZero, the learning thing, GPT-3, they're all neural nets, all deep learning neural nets, which means they have many layers. When we first started playing with neural nets, say back in the 80s, typically they'd be 2 or 3 levels, maybe 4. Now they could be 100 levels, and they could be, instead of having 50 or 100 or 500 nodes in a level, they might have thousands. And in fact, some of the really big neural nets like GPT-3 could have billions of links in the model. So they're really quite remarkable. But they're not actually intelligent. They are, and this is what I was making the point with Yosha, that they are a statistical learning model. They have made a whole series of little bit at a time adjustments to these weights until they give the right answer, at a high level of probability. But that's all they are. GPT-3 does not understand the English language, though it can do some remarkable things that can fool people into thinking that it does. And it's really, but it is a quite useful tool as long as you know what it's good for and what it's not good for. For instance, you would not want to use it at this stage for medical diagnosis because it is this neural net. It isn't always right. Some percentage of the time, it'll give you absolute nonsense. It's a small percentage currently, but it's there. So it doesn't actually know anything. It doesn't actually understand English. What it is a collation of the learning from looking at probably billions of words of English that Google has, not Google, the other guys, OpenAI has scooped off the internet and processed and created this static representation. That's the other thing about GPT-3. It does not change. Once you start using GPT-3, it learns nothing from your use of it. It's essentially this distillation of the billion things it has read. So the reading happens, it creates this artifact, which then does its GPT-3, but it doesn't learn anything from interacting with you. Hope that's helpful.
Oh, that's fantastic. The first question that comes to mind when I think about these things, and I spoke with Ken Stanley, who's at OpenAI, is as you're building these computers and you're making them smarter and smarter, and you're adding in a learning algorithm so that they can actually teach themselves. Do you fear, or is this just the fear of us plebeians or normies, of a runaway AI, a system that's so smart that we can't control it or don't even really understand what it's doing?
Yeah, this is the so-called AI risk discussion. By the way, Ken Stanley is one of my heroes because he's one of the people who has also done, in fact, he's done more interesting work in evolutionary neural nets than anybody else, I would say.
Oh, Ken Stanley changed my life. I read his book on the why greatness can't be planned, the novelty search, and that idea led me into a whole different way of thinking. Between him and Yosha Bach, they're heroes of mine for sure.
Yes. Most of my work originates from the University of Texas neural evolution work, and Ken Stanley is one of the students of that work. And so he's in that tradition, and probably the person that's pushed it the furthest, at least in terms of actually useful tools. But anyway, getting back to AI risk, it's funny, I talk about this fairly regularly. I was talking with one of my good buddies, Ben Goertzel, yesterday. In fact, he's the guy who coined the expression AGI. And he's created an AGI framework. He's written 15 books on the topic. And we talk about this regularly. And we both believe that, yes, in the long run, there is risk that an AI could take off the so-called technological singularity. And this is a very important concept. And in the simplest form, let's say the following. Let's say you finally get an AI that's a teeny bit smarter than a human, say 1.1. And let's suppose you give it the job of designing its successor. And the successor it creates is 1.2 as smart as a human. And then you say, I'll give that one the job of creating its successor, and the next one comes out at 1.5. And then the one after that, 1.9, the one after that, 3.3, and then 10, and then 50, and then 1,000, and then 10,000, and then 1,000,000. So it's conceivable, and there is a theory that could all happen in 6 or 8 weeks once you reach the takeoff threshold. Now, there are some of there are people who argue on, where is the takeoff threshold? You have to get to 1 million first before it's dangerous. I'm not sure. I don't think anybody knows the answer. But in terms of whether the work they're doing today, like GPT-3, is dangerous, I'd say absolutely not, because it's not. It's a static artifact that's been created. It can't continue to learn. It doesn't have any consciousness. It doesn't have any sense of self. Frankly, it's no more different than an oscilloscope. Basically, you put data in, you get something out. But it's something that those of us who are working in this field need to be aware of. And at some point, we'll have to become more proactive in building AI safety into what we're doing. Of course, Nick Bostrom's book, what the hell is the name of it? I don't remember, but is the place to start to read about AI safety. And MIRI, MIRI.org, has got some of the most cutting edge people thinking about AI safety, but realize they're in the AI safety business, so they're kind of overhyping it a little bit, in my opinion. So, but anyway, those are two good places to look for those who want to learn more about AI risk and AI safety.
So twice you've referenced consciousness in regards to machines, and I think for a lot of people this seems like something akin to magic or something that doesn't seem real, but that you could talk about using words, but to really say what would it mean for a machine to be conscious. But what do you mean when you say that?
Now this is actually the very center of my research, so I may go a little deeper here than usual. My own view is, there's various views on this, needless to say, from those who, the classic Cartesian dualism, which is the root in some ways of modern thinking about consciousness, which I believe, and most current researchers in consciousness believe, is wrong. But anyway, Rene Descartes believed that consciousness and the body were two separate materials, and that they talk to each other through the pineal gland, of all weird things, and that you could think of consciousness as being analogous to the Christian soul, and that when you died, the consciousness separated from the body, went and did its own thing, etc. I would say modern thinkers, mostly, at least scientific thinkers, reject that view, and they believe in consciousness as being emergent from the material. So the consciousness emerges from our brains and our bodies, and when the body dies, the consciousness dies, and it does not go on in some separate existence. It's not a separate material, so it's a uniformitarian view. Then there's a second fork, which those who believe that consciousness, I believe it's called functionalism, that if you had a computer that was similar enough to the way humans process, or even process it in a different way, you could nonetheless create an identical consciousness experience to that which a human has. I would say that I'm skeptical of that, and the school that I approach this question from is the school of John Searle, the Berkeley philosopher, who writes some amazingly accessible books, by the way. If you want to read a philosopher's take on the science of consciousness, look up John Searle. That's Searle. His view is that our consciousness, the only one that we know of, call it the animal consciousness, emerges from our bodies in a very complex way. It includes the brain, but it includes the gut, and it includes our skin, it includes our senses, everything else. And so attempting to duplicate our exact consciousness in a machine is going to be very, very difficult and probably won't happen anytime soon. However, he describes consciousness as a biological function like digestion or respiration, which has many components to it. Like, you can't put your finger on something in your brain and say, this is consciousness. Rather, it's a dance of lots of different things in the body and the mind. And just like in food science and in pharmaceuticals, we have things called digesters. They use bacteria, they use fungi, they use yeast to process raw chemicals and turn them into higher value products. And we call it a digester, even though that digester doesn't look anything like your colon and your stomach and your pancreas and your liver, but it does something analogous. it's kind of like digestion. So there's a long way around. So where I come out is that things like my conscious deer, very rudimentary, but and other machine consciousnesses that we're likely to see in the next 5 to 20 years are going to be analogous to what human consciousness is, but in no means closely identical to it. I know that's a whole series of pretty fine distinctions, but they're important when you think about this question.
Well, I remember when we were about to do your podcast, we had kind of talked a little bit about consciousness, and I had mentioned the daemon, right? The inner voice that's behind people. And you were kind of like, well, there's some philosophers out there that say the decisions that you make are not actually driven by you. In fact, we can watch in an MRI that you make the decision, and then you're conscious. Well, then you become conscious of the fact that you made that decision. So something is going on behind the works, and just because you perceive that you had the choice doesn't mean that you actually did. Is that a fair representation of that?
Yes, that's called the Libet result, one of the most famous studies in cognitive science, that it appears that the decision, for instance, to move your finger happens somewhere on the order of half a second before you actually move your finger. And one variant on that is, okay, what is free will, right? And one variant is that the decision to move your finger is part of the unconscious machinery of the mind. And what the conscious layer has is a very short window to veto that suggestion. So it happens, and you have a very short period where you can say, no, don't do it. And that's essentially what it means. The fact that the neurons are starting to fire to move your finger before you're conscious of it, but typically you're conscious of it before the finger actually moves. So you have a veto window, and maybe that's all free will is. And the other important thing about consciousness, particularly, and this is where I work very closely and where my simulations are digging in, is that consciousness orchestrates and is a workspace for the integration of unconscious processes. The vast preponderance of our processing is unconscious, but signals from the unconscious are constantly rolling into the brain at a relatively slow rate, which is quite interesting. And then the processing occurs very slowly, relatively speaking, to the unconscious in the conscious brain, and it's the dance between the two which makes animals who we are. And I should point that out, that the school of thought that I'm involved with believes that animals from at least reptiles up are conscious. So consciousness is not just a human artifact. It's been something that's been evolving probably since amphibians, and certainly, our dogs are conscious, birds are conscious, reptiles are conscious. And so when we talk about consciousness in this biological Cyrillian sense, it's actually much more productive to consider all these creatures are conscious. It gives us a lot more to work with rather than just our own introspection. What makes our consciousness seem different, and indeed be much more powerful, at least the Cyrillian view, is that we have a new class of conscious contents, meaning symbols, language, that we can manipulate and that we can store in our memories and we can do cool things with. And so that makes our consciousness be able to do lots of things that, let's say, our dog can't do. On the other hand, our dog can do a lot of things that we can't do. Like a dog, in theory, can diagnose somebody who has cancer based on their smell. We don't have a brain that processes smell in the same way a dog does. And so in that domain, the dog's consciousness is more powerful than ours. But on the other hand, a dog can't write Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and at least the occasional human can. And that comes from the ability to manipulate symbols.
Well, in your conversation with Yosha Bach, I remember laughing out loud and then actually stopping and taking what you were saying very seriously, which is, if you look at the contents or the size of a brain, right, of an elephant or of a whale, they're massively larger than a human being's. And Yosha said, well, maybe they all became autistic because they realized that consciousness in and of itself, or the ability to work yourself into this symbolic world where you end up in offices and need to do drugs to do all these things. Maybe they became, maybe they decided to shut down some of this consciousness in a different way, which I thought at first I kind of laughed at, and then thought, well, actually, that's maybe a rather serious observation.
Yeah, Yosha is an amazing out of the box thinker. And I think and I never had that thought, right? And very few people have the kind of thoughts that Yosha has. On the other hand, there's not an iota of evidence for that. I'm pretty firm on the idea that within our evolutionary tree, I mean, i.e., those things that are we all use a uniform DNA encoding. It's very clear that all life that we know of on Earth is all descendant from a single root. And so within that evolutionary tree, I believe humans are the only ones that have clearly passed over the line to have high-powered use of symbols. And can't prove it, but it would seem there's no sign at all that any other animal has come even close to the human level of symbol usage that we have. And if someone were just barely over the line, let's say the equivalent of a proto-human, say 300,000 years ago, it's not at all clear they would have the capability, the technology, or the inclination to be able to back away from that. It's taken 300,000 years to evolve a being like Yosha in the human line that could have that radical thought. So I very much doubt that's true of the elephant and the whale, but I can't prove it.
Well, the symbolism is an interesting concept. In fact, you prompted me to write something down that I had always kept in symbols, the well-actually graph that I put right up here, right? But this is very powerful. I think the ability to draw something and be able to break down a complex set of thoughts and put it into lines and arrows and or mathematics or any of those things, and be able to, for me to hand it to you and then for you to be able to hand it on. I mean, once you have that ability to capture a symbol and then push it forward is, well, we've seen exactly how far that takes us. And it doesn't take very long from when you get written language to being able to do some pretty astounding things.
Yeah. And in fact, for instance, the alphabet that we use, alphabetic language, is fundamentally different than the ideogram languages of like China, et cetera. It's a very late invention, somewhere around 800 BC. So a mere 2,800 years ago, the alphabetic language came into being. And just think what's happened in the last 2,800 years. Basically, most of what we know, there was history before that, but it was pretty primitive in a lot of ways. But and as you say, the ability to use artifacts outside to amplify the power of our consciousness. The smartest mathematician in the world could not do a big, long 20-page proof in his head, right? He needs paper to write it down, or a whiteboard, or like that one over there, right? In fact, I remember one of my favorite physics professors at MIT. He did his work on 6 blackboards that slid up and down and all this sort of stuff, and he would just completely cover them with equations when he was in the middle of a run trying to crack something in theoretical physics. And he was a way smarter dude than I am, but he couldn't have done it in his head. He needed the green board and the chalk to do that. So the development of the alphabetic language, the Hindu Arabic numbers, turns out manipulating Roman numerals, for instance, we would never have made the progress that we've made. We would never have that thing over there I'm pointing to on the wall, the Apollo rocket. Or at least we would not have had it by now if we were still using Roman numerals to do the engineering calculations. Hindu Arabic numbers, the 0 through 9 digits, and the idea of power of 10 places just turns out to be a shitload better for externalizing our cognition about things mathematical and things quantitative. And so, development of those psychotechnologies is what literally got us to the moon.
One of the astounding observations a good friend of mine named Bernard Sue put forward was an observation about the Chinese language and how it has not changed over time. So whereas if we try and go back, like right now I'm reading Mark Twain, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, and even that language is somewhat stilted, somewhat difficult to get to, because the English language can change so quickly, can evolve and adapt. But the ability to be able to go backwards and read and really understand and have an equal understanding of what the people meant, whereas in the Chinese language, you can go back hundreds of years and school children can still read those ancient texts. And there's got to be a trade-off between those two things. One that evolves really quickly and allows you to adapt to new ideas, but another one that has stability and, kind of long staying power.
Yeah, that's an interesting, a very interesting statement. Though you'll notice that most Chinese science is written in English these days, right? And I've yet to see a computer language based on Chinese. So that's an interesting idea for someone to try to create. But I will take the point that there indeed is that design space trade-off between fidelity through time and adaptation to the current needs of the world. It would make sense that alphabetic languages are more adaptable than others. And of course, even alphabetic languages for cultural reasons evolve at different rates. For instance, the French have an academy that defines legally what French is. And English never has. English is the most opportunistic of alphabetic languages. And it's this bizarre hybrid that's about 60% Anglo-Saxon and 40% French in its roots. And well, at least it was, let's say, 500 years ago. And we willy-nilly adopt Yiddish, we adopt Italian, we adopt Spanish, we adopt terms from anywhere and from anybody, and we pervert them and use them for our own purposes. And actually, that reinforces your statement that makes English less preservationist. Even something as relatively recent as Chaucer, about 12th century, it's really hard work to read. Even Shakespeare, most people, if they read slowly, can read Shakespeare, but he uses all kinds of weird words that we're not really familiar with. They have different meanings, etc. And of course, he doesn't have a lot of words that we have. So even Shakespeare, who's a mere, less than 500 years ago, is getting harder, and Chaucer, damn hard. And you go back to Beowulf, Old English, impossible. You cannot read Beowulf in the original Old English without a dictionary, basically. And that's maybe 1,600 years ago. While you're right, you can go read a Chinese classic from 2,500 years ago and at least make some sense of it. And the same is also true of ancient Greek. It's interesting that ancient Greek, while it conquered the world, Alexander the Greek, and the Hellenic period afterwards, there are no languages that derived from ancient Greek. It's very curious. Well, Latin, of course, has hundreds of languages that have, many languages, many of them now extinct, that derive from Latin. There's not a single language that derived from ancient Greek. It was quite a bit more conservative than Latin.
You had a guy on, I'm not going to be able to remember his name off the top of my head, but he was basically making a challenge to the kind of Western understanding of religion and God. And the conversation was about the Silk Road, and he brought up Zoroastrianism and the Western understanding of that being all incorrect. Is this ringing a bell for you? You've done so many
Alexander
podcasts.
Bard.
That was a phenomenal interview, and I have no idea if he's right or not, but just the ideas that he was slamming into my mind, I found to be really striking. And I haven't gotten all the way through it yet because it was so slow, but I wondered if you guys got to language, because it seemed really important. The Silk Road with its language ends up being a mind virus, right? It is the software that you use to be able to convert ideas, just like we're saying. Some of them evolve quickly, some of them don't. Some of them are so impenetrable that then that makes it so ideas of Western culture maybe don't get into them. The Russian language is notably difficult to learn, so it makes it difficult unless people want. Now I think it's easier for ideas to hop, but they were much more preserved from that. Anyway, it was just a thought that I had regarding that. I thought that was a phenomenal interview you did.
Yeah, it was. Alexander is a heady dude. He's also intentionally controversial, so he says stuff to stir up the shit, right? But he is truly a brilliant dude. And so, if people want to get a very, very interesting tap dance through thinking about religion, in this particular case, his proposed new internet religion, right? Check out Alexander Bard on the Jim Rutt Show at jimruttshow.com. There's a little plug there, if you don't mind.
Not at all, man. I think your podcast is truly an excellent place where it's not just that you're finding such interesting people. I think you have a deep gravity well that people just kind of fall into, and you've built it over a long period of time. but your base knowledge to be able to communicate with them. I mean, people can't just slide ideas past you. There are a lot of things that Bard was talking about that I'd have had to be like, okay, I guess that's true. But you kept up with them, which makes me wonder, what is your reading regimen like? How do you I know you get off the internet for 6 months at a time, or at least social media. What do you do to keep this pace up?
It's funny. I've been starting 100 books a year since I was about 10. And I finish about 75. And I've done it all throughout my life, whether I was a loafing bum hitchhiking around the country, which we talked about on your last podcast, or whether I was a hyper busy public company CEO whose day during the workday was scheduled in 15-minute blocks, including to go take a shit, right? I still found time to read my 100 books a year. And I just did it late at night and early in the morning. And so I have always been a relentless reader. And of course, the internet's made it easier to dig. So you read a reference in a book. I'll often go over to Google Scholar and pull up the reference and read that, and maybe read a scientific paper or two. So I'm essentially a self-directed learning machine who has read something like 5,500 books in my life and probably 50,000 scientific papers or something like that. And so I happen to have a pretty large body of knowledge. And I would say I have a decent, though not top of the curve, ability to integrate them into a coherent body. So, even if someone says something that isn't specifically about the topic we're talking about, I have a large body of other data that's analogous and by comparison that I can bring to bear. And then just a little trick. I mean, it's not really a trick. It's just a thing I do about my podcast is I actually read the goddamn books, right? A lot of podcasters don't. I actually read the books, annotate them carefully, sometimes do some side research if I want to really be able to challenge the speaker. And I, on average, spend about 10 hours preparing for each podcast. So combine that with this, large kind of self-directed education program I've been on since I was 10 years old. And then the fact that I really do read the books in detail allows me to engage the authors, I think, in a way that is somewhat uncommon.
So one of the things I love about your podcast is your willingness to challenge people, right? For me, normally my sense is I like finding rapport. I like finding ways that we can shake our heads yes and get interested. And I don't mind pushing back because I'm actually a relatively disagreeable person. But I find that you are willing to push much harder on people than I think most of the time they get. And what I find is that your guests enjoy it. I think there aren't very many people that you have on that aren't prepared to handle it, but it's very, very different. I think that's why I would tell people, go listen to his podcast, because Jim Rutt does an excellent job of showing exactly how to disagree with people. But this makes me think that on your Game B idea, which I've now looked into, and I've had quite a few members of the ag community get very interested in this. I do have some pushback on this I'd like to discuss now that I've thought about it and gotten to look at it, and I wanted to push back on it. But for anybody that didn't get to check out our first one, do you want to give an explanation of Game B and kind of where you're at and where you're headed to?
Yeah, sure. First, let me just address this idea of pushing back, which is indeed something I do on many of my podcasts. But one of the things I don't do is play gotcha journalism. I'm not looking for the thing to embarrass the guy or anything like that. It's always about something substantive, right? They say X, but I say, well, you haven't actually proven X. You've pushed X forward as a hypothesis. The evidence, here's some other evidence that points the other direction, et cetera. So, I push back fairly often, actually, as you know. I never do it in the gotcha sense, only on substance and only with evidence. And I think
amen. That's actually exactly what I mean. I think there's very few pieces. I think one of the reasons people have gotten so bad at conflict is they don't actually see conflict done very often. And so I think that conflict is good. It makes everybody's ideas better. I think there's no person that I've ever heard you pushing back on that didn't actually like it because it forced them to speak their thoughts that probably they hadn't even put some of those things that they knew into words. And I find it to be expansive rather than diminishing.
Yeah, and I've never gotten into an ugly conversation with anybody at all on the podcast. As you say, all of them go with the flow, and then some of them have told me afterwards, "Holy shit, that did take me into a whole new thinking. I'm going to write a paper about that." So anyway, back to Game B. It's an idea that evolved from a group of our work back in 2012, which actually started to create a political party, which was kind of a fiasco, but it ended up collecting a group of that eventually grew to about 60 people, really smart, interesting people from many disciplines. And the idea of a new social operating system for society that was congruent to the challenges that we currently face is what arose. And that's what Game B is, right? It's literally an attempt to say, all right, there's something deeply wrong with our world. And a lot of that has to be the fact that our institutional structures, our ways about thinking about things, truthfully haven't changed all that much since the 18th and 19th century. When I hear people argue about capitalism versus socialism, I go, why are you so in love with ancient thinkers, right? It's 21st century, people. I don't think the answer to what comes next with respect to how we organize our society is likely to be well described by either 18th century, i.e. capitalist thinking, or 19th century, i.e. socialist thinking. And so we're trying to do thinking at that level, but fresh, with a blank sheet of paper, with some of the smartest people around, on what will it take to get humanity through the 21st century without destroying ourselves, and to build a vibrant and wonderful future for the human race.
So I like this so much, I've been sharing it everywhere. I've talked about your stuff on podcasts that I've been invited on. I know you've been talking with Jason Mauk, who I think is an interesting character in the field of alternative kind of styles of agriculture. The thing that strikes me is how will this movement possibly grow at scale? It seems to me that it requires people to take on a level of labor that we haven't had people doing for generations. So where do you think people will be? Where do you think how will this become water that runs downhill and makes it easier over time for people to join this?
Yeah, excellent question. In fact, we talk about that a lot, right? And if you've gotten yourself into the discourse, you've seen it's pretty highbrow, right? A lot of it. This is not designed for the guy who dropped out of high school and lives in a trailer at this time. But in the future, it has to get to that person if it's going to be a social operating system for society. So there were several of our founding team that had business careers. In fact, I think the original 25 Game Beers, 5 or 6 of us had been CEOs of reasonably significant companies. And we all knew about the famous Jeffrey Moore crossing the chasm curve, which essentially says that for a successful consumer product, you typically go through a series of markets. The first is the innovator market. Less than 2% of people are innovators and are open to hear entirely new things. The next is called the early adopter, and it's probably 10 or 12%. Then there's the early majority, the people who hop on a trend once the early adopters have tried it out. A canonical example is the flat screen TV. When those things first existed in the 90s, they were like $30,000, right? And only a few cranks bought them. In fact, the first flat screen TV I bought was $10,000 in the year 2000, I think. And then, and of course, that was a very oddball, and I mostly bought it just to see what the fuck it was all about, right? I'm not even that much of a TV watcher. But being as part of my dance along the edge, I went, hey, what the hell is this flat screen TV shit? And now, of course, the most recent flat screen TV I bought was $199, and had built-in Roku and all this stuff, and it's quite remarkable.
And now we're hanging out on VR, right?
And now we're hanging out on VR. And so we think that the evolution of Game B will follow the similar curve, and that we're still in the innovator phase. We're talking to the 1 or 2%. And in fact, a small subset of that, because as we described, who has the ears to hear the message yet? We actually have a writing program that's writing an introduction to Game B, and that was our topic last night, is where do we want to position the language and vocabulary and concepts for the next written description of Game B. And we decided still in the 2% phase, a little closer to the line between the 2% and the 12%, but we're still talking to the 2%. And so that's one part of the story. But the second is, and this is, I think, the most exciting thing about Game B right now, is it's been a talk shop since 2013. And it's now just about to start going into practice at the local on-the-ground stage through what we call proto-Bs, which are actual communities of people living in part Game B ways of life and actually developing local operating systems for governing how they live. So the very first one has actually closed on its land and will be opening its doors sometime before the end of the year. And I am pretty confident at least one more and maybe two will open its doors before the end of this year. Another track to go from the theory to the practice is the concept of Game B ventures. And that's the idea of businesses that are formed with Game B operating systems, quite different than the command and control systems we typically see in Western business structures. They will have probably in most cases employee ownership, stakeholder ownership of different sorts. Many of them will aim not to maximize economic return in the short term, but for longevity and providing stable employment for the people, and yet will provide sufficient return to the investors to make it an attractive proposition for investors. So I think that a big turn is about to happen in the Game B world, where we go from some extraordinarily interesting thinking and writing to practice. And I have warned everybody that a fair amount of our theory is likely to be turned out to be wrong or very incomplete. That practice always takes precedence over theory. And then we're about to enter an epoch where we will have, actually I should put these things in my hands so you can see my hands move like a good Italian. We will have theory, which we have in abundance, but we will just about now have practice. Practice will disprove some theory, will show the incompleteness of some theory, and will open up opportunities for new theory. And so theory will get rewritten as practice happens. People will take the new theory, apply it to new practice, and the same thing will happen again and again. What does this sound like? It sounds like science, right? It sounds like the idea of hypothesis, which is theory, and then experiment or data, which is practice. And in science, we've had this amazing ratchet that's been going on for 300 years that's taken us from really not understanding the world at all to having pretty good, not complete understanding of the world in a mere 300 years. And we're in the epoch now where Game B is about to enter that ratchet. And I'm extremely excited about how that will go.
I'm very excited about it. That's why I push many people. I had so many listeners wanting to talk about it. One observation that somebody made that I think you kind of confirmed in a way is that a lot of the people that seem to be very interested in Game B won Game A. And I think that like, for example, there's not very many people out there that have sold a company for $15 billion. But those that have can come to the conclusion that even if you get to the top of the world, you aren't magically like lifted off into Olympus where everything is good and everything's okay, and you still have meaning or you're still searching for something else. And so for you, the conclusion could be, hey, Game A didn't give me the satisfaction, therefore I'm going to move towards Game B. But most people, particularly I would say young men with testosterone and aggression and the things that allow you to push through during difficult times, that pursuit of Game A's hierarchy is one that drives them or has driven much of society. And I know we talked a little bit about the hunter-gatherer cultures of the past, saying, well, there were people that have done this, but that's a pretty distant thing to be hearkening back to. I think kind of a tall order. What do you think about trying to get the very people that you're going to need to be doing the heavy lifting and the work, being passionate about about winning at Game A first?
That's interesting. Very good question. And now I will say that while the original founder team had a definite heavy loading of Game A successful people, frankly, because we had the time and the resources to do it, right? Most of the participants in the Game B movement today are millennial men, actually, about 25% women. And interestingly, the Times, as we've marched on, has produced lots of very talented people who are already nauseated by Game A. You know, the idea of operating in a command and control structure, doing something that's probably bad for the world and bad for the humans. An amazing number of people are starting to get that. I mean, that was extremely radical thinking in 2012. But by 2021, those with ears to hear are out there and in abundance. And of course, that is indeed the biggest challenge. Can we capture the human drive for creation and innovation into a world that's not denominated principally by rewards in terms of stuff or positional goods? Now, it's true, people are still going to be looking for status at some level, though perhaps not as ferociously as in the Game A world. But there will be ways for people to have status. Who has contributed a new idea for local farming, for instance, that really worked, or who wrote a great sonnet, or who's a really good child care person, who came up with a new biscuit recipe to use buckwheat instead of wheat flour. Those things could have very, very high status, and people could compete in some sense for that. That may be where it falls a cropper, but I can see it, and there are now thousands of people who seem to be smelling this opportunity to change the game that we're playing. And I will say, even though I did make it pretty high up in the stack in Game A, it was sort of by accident. I wasn't particularly ambitious at all. In fact, I turned down 3 different huge opportunities to make giant steps in Game A world at various times in my life because I just didn't feel like it. I would say I was never driven by ambition to climb the Game A hierarchies, but I nonetheless did, which was kind of interesting and curious.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see where this goes. The thing that really, it didn't surprise me. I actually kind of thought that it would happen, but it definitely did happen, was that the ag world in my circle, when we started talking about Game B, people got really interested. They're saying, hey, we're already living out in the countryside. We would welcome more people out here. We want these communities to be revitalized. We've got buildings for sale. We've got property that's out here, and we don't really want it to go to some giant consortium where they just send in people to manage the land as employees that come and go as migrants. We want people living and being a part of this. So I really hope that as you get more and more offers to go speak with people in the ag community on their podcasts and getting out there, I hope you and other people in Game B get there, because I think that is going to be a key piece in making this work. We had a chance to sit down with Mike Compton, for example, the rancher from Nevada that also grew crops. And these people, they want community as bad as anything that you could imagine, and I think the Game B is the only train that's coming down the tracks even remotely close to where they live. So I think they're all saying, come in here, we want to help build and get them engaged. So if people wanted to get engaged with Game B, tell us again how they can do it.
The best way to do it currently is to go to game-b.org, a website called Game B Home. We used to be on Facebook, and we still do have a group on Facebook, but essentially all the interesting work is now happening over on the Game B Home, and we'll probably be closing the Game B Facebook group down fairly soon. And there are lots of people, as we always say, the first step to playing Game B is find the others. Game B is an inherently social game, and you can't play it fully by yourself. So find the others at game-b.org. Look forward to seeing you. And we're currently not really open to the public. We have, we're mostly just bringing in our own Game B people from Facebook and Twitter. But you'll be asked 3 questions, and one of the questions will be, where did you hear about it? Say, I heard about it from Jim Rutt, that asshole, on Vance Crowe's podcast. And if you do that, we'll let you in.
So, Jim, as we're wrapping up, what was your experience of doing this in VR? Now that we've spent an hour here, how did it feel? What was the experience like?
It was good. It was, it's just like my first 1 hour experience. Takes a little getting used to, and you're the one that warned me. It'll take 40 hours before you get the zen of VR, and I suspect you're probably right. But I thought we had a good conversation. I thought, I don't like doing podcasts put it this way, I don't do my own podcasts on Zoom. I do them on an audio-only tool called Zencastr. Now, I've been on lots of other people's podcasts doing Zoom, and I kind of enjoy that. Get to ham it up a little bit. But this is kind of nice. It's less hammy maybe than Zoom, right? Where because we have all the wave our hands, open our eyes wide open, etc. We sometimes tend to overdo that a little bit. But here we have this interesting sense of being. I mean, it feels like you're 3 feet from me, right? And I think I've kind of felt that. You saw me use my hands a little bit. You see me looking around, gesture to the board. All that is cool. All that is neat. And I like it. So provisional, thumbs up.
Yeah, I same thing. So this is the first time I've recorded a podcast or done anything like this other than the book club. And a couple of observations. One, when you leaned in like this, it gave me a feeling of closeness, right? Like we're actually here. And I think when I take my headset off, I am going to have had a much more visceral experience of I've spent time with Jim than I would have if we were on Zoom. It gets a little uncomfortable. I don't know, maybe I could have had a better chair or something where my arms were better supported. But overall, I feel like I guess I am confirmed again that I feel like this creates a deeper connection between the two people talking than I think even Zoom did.
Yeah. Now I would say that, as I'm thinking about this, if we had more expressive avatars, that would help a lot. And I don't, again, there's going to be some difficulties in doing the man-machine interface. Like, how do you raise your eyebrows, for instance, right? And how do you smile? And,
I don't think that my avatar does, but your avatar, the eyes move. And so I find myself trying to catch your eyes. Like, even if your head is still, they have the eyeballs themselves move around a little bit.
Oh,
and
that's
so
cool.
I found myself thinking like, oh, is Jim like making eye contact with me?
Why don't you get an avatar that has eyes next time?
I will. I guess I learned quite a bit about the avatar. I actually like your avatar better than mine. I think mine is too, you can't see my fingers move. I can see your fingers move. So if you even touch the buttons, I can actually see your fingers even kind of jostling a little bit. And then, I like your avatar better. And I think focusing on these tiny details just stacks more and more bandwidth on top to be able to make it a better and better experience.
And every innovation is that way, right? You start off with a base invention, in this case, the actual technology of VR, and then you build the things around it that make it better and better and better and more useful for real people. And more expressive avatars, I think, is a very important place to go to make this thing come closer to face and be less like kind of sort of like Zoom. But I would say this second hour of VR has, shall we say, not kept me from taking the next step to learn more.
All right. Well, Jim, thanks for joining me. We'll have you on again anytime you're free.
All right. Thanks for having me. This has been a damn interesting experience. And I don't know if anybody else has ever done a VR podcast. Do you know?
I looked them up. I couldn't find any. So I think we may be, if we're not the first, we're definitely up there in close proximity to the beginning.